Habemus' vision of competitiveness. SCSP's new report is going to explain just how America should compete for the 21st century. To join us today to explain exactly what technology's role is in the future of national competitiveness and what both the government and private sector should do about it, I am joined by David Lin, Abby Kakura, and Venkat Somala. Welcome to China Talk, everyone.
Thanks. Nice to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
David, why don't you kick us off?
So let me start with what is the Special Competitive Studies Project. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan private foundation, and we have both a near and a far history. The near history is that we're very much an offshoot or a private sector continuation of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which was a government-led, congressionally mandated commission that was set up in 2019 and ran through 2021. It was chaired by former Google CEO, Dr. Eric Schmidt, and the executive director of the commission was Ili Bajraktari. And the scope of the commission was to look at ways the U.S. government can better utilize artificial intelligence for national security applications. When the commission concluded in 2021, Dr. Schmidt and Ili got together and talked about how its important work should be continued in a private function, and thus they stood up the Special Competitive Studies Project. Now that kind of segues to our far history, which was while Dr. Schmidt was working on a book with the late Dr. Henry Kissinger called The Age of AI, they got to talking, and Dr. Kissinger mentioned how back in the 50s, he led this thing called the Special Studies Project, which was backed by the Rockefellers in the post-war transition era. And it was very much taking that moment in history as an inflection point to look at how the U.S. government and how the United States as a country should, reassess its position after the war and chart the path forward. And so Dr. Schmidt really saw that as a inspiration, and thus, or fast forward to 2021, stood up the Special Competitive Studies Project, with competitive focused on trying to capture the modern day geopolitical state of affairs, with a focus in particular with the tech competition and tech competition with China. And so there we are, Special Competitive Studies Project, SCSP, and we've been going full steam ahead ever since.
Yeah, so, it's interesting. The Special Studies Project started in 1956. This is, after the Korean War, so they're really in it by then. Today, it's interesting because I think a lot of the sort of premises that, that were a launching point for the Special Studies Project, like the Soviet Union, a problem. I don't think the American polity is quite as bought in as a system to the sort of challenge that you guys are framing today that we talk about every week on China Talk. So, it was interesting reading the first chunk of this report and kind of nodding my head being yeah, of course, doesn't everyone get this? But the answer is clearly not, right? So, curious how you sort of think about, the whole mobilizing for national competition thing where the atmospherics are very different from the Eisenhower era.
Yeah, obviously back in both in the Korean War, the Cold War, post-World War II, these were all existential crises for the nation. We felt these conflicts at our front doors. And, there's a running joke that, there's no such thing as an innovation emergency, right? But I think what we try to tee up in this Vision for Competitiveness report is that there is urgency at our doorstep in the sense that three big things are changing, and three big things have shifted since the Cold War and since the post-war era. One is that science, technology are becoming bigger. They're becoming more complicated. Two, the nature of the geopolitical competition is changing. Our foremost geopolitical competitor today is China, and China is unlike any other geopolitical competitor that we faced before. They are immensely resourced, they're well organized, and they're, despite the perception that China is a monolith, they are very open to taking risks and experimentation with their industrial policies and with their innovation ecosystem. And then third, the big thing domestically that has changed since, the wartime era is that there is a widening divide between industry, government, and academia, and that our domestic innovation ecosystem is becoming misaligned, and we need some galvanizing force to bring these back together in the name of progressing forward the nation, but also pushing the frontiers of innovation.
I think I'll just add to David's great points that I think we hear you on the American polity not being necessarily as on the same page about these issues as, at least it seems in retrospect, looking back at the post-war era. And I think that's part of why what SCSP is trying to doing is build a movement around these issues. You may have seen we recently hosted the first ever AI Expo for national competitiveness, and the idea there with the event that brought more than 10,000 people through the doors of the convention center over 2 days was to really put the US innovation ecosystem on display and that of our key allies and partners, and show the participants that, as one of our speakers at the expo put it, we're more united than we realize. And there are all of these actors from national labs to startups to tech companies that are working towards similar goals and that have a massive role to play in building and maintaining US innovation power. And the expo is one way that we can sort of bring those people all into the same room because the startups aren't necessarily talking to the government labs, but for 2 days in DC in May, they were at booths right next to one another. So this is all part of what we're trying to do with our work. It's not just publishing the reports, but actually convening these actors in one place and getting them talking about these issues that we're more aligned on than we may realize.
I also made the pilgrimage down to DC to join the expo, and it was really striking because it does probably feel like a little lonely hanging out in Alexandria talking about these issues, or me like sitting in my room recording this podcast talking about technology and national competition, and then just seeing a whole community of people across the government, across the across AI labs, across, I mean, there was like a freaking EV startup there for Christ's sakes. It was a remarkable gathering around this topic, which like I don't think should really be all that controversial. Is like, yeah, it would be nicer if we like innovated better and faster and like worked in concert on it to make sure that like the 21st century is more defined by like American values broadly defined than like the ones coming out of like the current leadership in Beijing. And to watch that reified not just in like download numbers, but like in like actual human beings talking to each other was a really special thing to get to witness. So anyways, thanks for putting that on. I'm sure it was a lot of work. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about AGI. So there was recently Leopold Aschenbrenner, who formerly of the Future Fund, formerly of OpenAI, came out a few weeks ago with an epic 200-page PDF, which I think is how all books should be published nowadays, alongside a 4.5-hour Dwarkish interview with the basic premise that AI is going to get a whole lot better, a whole lot faster than you think. And very quickly, this will sort of inevitably be something that looks a lot like a Manhattan Project, where national governments are going to be the ones taking the lead in making sure that their countries are the ones that are pushing the sort of research envelope, and bringing us into like a hard takeoff future where maybe one day we get to colonize galaxies or what have you. But before there, I think he raises some really interesting questions about government capacity for whatever AI future we're going to live in. And I don't think we're going to answer whether or not like the fast versus slow AI takeoff is going to be the thing that's happening in the future. But I guess I'm curious for your takes on, what different steps the public sector broadly defined should be preparing for that are maybe useful in both timelines, and then we can kind of go timeline by timeline of fast versus slow, and what changes that will end up meaning for the government and society at large.
Yeah, so I think he raises a lot of points that are valid. So I do agree that AGI and ASI are coming soon. So maybe even before GPT-2, there were estimates for when AGI would arrive that looked like 50 years from here. So 2050, 2060. But because scaling laws have seemingly held, and that log linear relationship between the amount of compute that we throw into a model and its performance has held, these estimates for when we're going to reach AGI have been drastically shifted forward. So now we're talking about timescales on 5 to 7 years. And I think that poses a lot of implications because for such a revolutionary technology, it's healthy to sort of have iterative deployment where the society and government understands what this capability is, where it's heading, and can develop a relationship and a response to that technology. And the fact that AGI is coming in a 5 to 7 year time frame, or that's what a lot of predictions are centered around, just enhances the need to modernize governance for the innovation age. And so we have a whole section up for this in the V4C report. And it basically breaks down into how do we sort of capitalize on the innovative aspects of this technology and the promises that it holds, while still mitigating and balancing it against the risks. And one key thing that we propose is that it's not feasible to regulate every single use case of AI. We need to focus on the highly consequential cases of AI. And to sort of push this effort forward, in November 2023, SCSP released their high consequence AI framework to identify AI use cases with the greatest societal impact. And the idea is that regulators can build on this framework by identifying high consequence AI use cases and implement their governance strategies that are best suited for each sector. And that can be informed by their risk tolerance and technical considerations in each of those sectors. So that's one key way that we think governance will have to sort of adapt to this new age of innovation, where even the rate of innovation itself is progressing at a rate that's never been seen before.
Do you want to talk about an edge case in that risk framework? Like what was, I don't know, there are some that are like, yeah, I mean, where are the most interesting kind of gray areas and just how tight or loose you'd want to regulate AI circa 2028?
Yeah, so we sort of break the framework for identifying highly consequential AI use cases into harm categories and benefit categories. And there's clear things that you would expect, like, is there going to be any physical injury, or what are the impacts to physical health? Is there going to be economic loss? What is the opportunity loss? But there's also like more downstream implications that we consider. So like, what is the environmental impact? How will this change the epistemic landscape and sort of the information that we're consuming? And those things are much harder to sort of assess with high confidence. But the framework is mostly centered around identifying which could have high consequence applications and then promoting regulators to then pay specific and special attention to those high consequence cases.
I think in addition to all of the ways we're thinking about governance, something SCSP has really been thinking about are what are the technology positions that the United States should pursue in the 21st century? And AGI is a major piece of this equation. The basic thesis of our Vision for Competitiveness report is that technology will be the sine qua non element of victory and competitiveness in the 21st century. And the way that will play out is through innovation power. So the nation that masters the ability to innovate and out innovate its rivals will be best positioned to lead in all of the instruments of power and leverage those for strategic ends. So if you think about AGI, it is sort of the prerequisite technology that the United States needs to get right if it wants to lead in all of the other technologies that are enabling and converging with AI. So SCSP has listed 6 technologies that are important for the strategic competition this decade and beyond. There's AI, microelectronics or computing power in general, as manifested in microelectronics today, potentially other forms of computing power in the future, and advanced networks. Those three make up this digital triangle that hardware, software, networks define the digital domain, and then biotechnology, energy, and the convergence of all of the above in advanced manufacturing. These are the areas that will be the buckets of innovation moving forward, the primary buckets of innovation. They're general purpose technologies. And AI is a key part of every single one of them as an enabler. And also, some of these technologies make up the constituent parts of the AI stack. But if we want to get these right, AGI will be sort of the key to unlocking a flywheel for innovation power.
Sure. So, let's talk a little bit about like winning AGI. One of the really interesting one of the really interesting like things that the Leopold post posits, right, is that like we're not taking this seriously today. And the US might have to start taking it really seriously tomorrow. And I think there are two sort of pieces of that. One is the like, what can the US do to slow China down? And the other is, what role is the government potentially going to have to play in, helping like spin up a moonshot with $1 trillion data center or what have you to kind of like enable the God model to be developed and deployed, right here in Virginia. So, let's start with the sort of slow China down piece. There was some reporting recently that a lot of the large Chinese AI players have been able to get access to the latest and greatest NVIDIA chips just by walking through the front door at AWS and Microsoft. And at the same time, one of the things that Leopold was really harping on was this idea of insider risk and the fact that these sort of algorithmic innovations are not being, taken care of the way you would a schema for a F-35, but more like, just like living on someone's Slack. Which is maybe not the right way to necessarily guard like the secrets to the future of humanity. So yeah, curious on the sort of right balance that the U.S. should be thinking about in kind of like openness to the various ways in which China is interacting with the U.S. AI ecosystem.
There is controversy, right, over whether or not we should work toward AGI, whether or not we should not, all the back and forth there. I think regardless of where you land, I think there is a fair, I don't always hesitate saying consensus, but I think we shouldn't hesitate believing that our competitors, China in particular, is working on a pathway toward AGI. And so then the question becomes, okay, if our competitors are the first to achieve AGI, however it's defined, where does that leave the US and our allies and partners with regard to our relative competitiveness? So I think that should be the fundamental theory of the case to why we need to work toward AGI. Sure, yes, we absolutely need the research security, and doing so, the guardrails, and pay attention to all those safeguards. But moving toward AGI, I think, is a fundamental piece of the competition. Now, how do we ensure that the AGI we end up with is the AGI that roughly reflects the democratic values and principles and ethics that we want to represent in the world, geopolitically and technologically? To me, this seems to have some resemblance of when cyber first became a conversation back in the late 2000s, 2010s.
Sure.
Where we just all of a sudden discovered that foreign state-backed hackers were hacking into our networks and stealing our IP and stealing trade secrets. One approach would be to roughly adopt the playbook that we did to handle cyber threats, which is first and foremost getting better information sharing between industry and government. to bolster network defenses, but also have better situational awareness, no pun intended, of what's happening in the pathway toward AGI.
I think to me, the Leopold article and his discussion of this really highlights the need for public-private partnerships because the industry actors and government both bring different strengths to the table or could bring different strengths to the table in talking about how this tech is developing and the strategic context. The tech companies they know way better than government where the frontier of the technology is today and where it's heading. And I think there are certain forums where it would be good to be able to have habitual, routine conversations with government, whether it's direct conversations or through a third party about where is the cutting edge of the tech and where is it going. Government needs to talk to industry to understand where that is. And at the same time, the companies, they're not spending their resources on understanding China, on the geopolitical competition. That's where government can sort of lay paint the strategic picture for them, and it would be useful to both sides to have routine mechanisms to be able to share that information.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like they're the sort of Silicon Valley mindset is it's either like full nationalization or it's we do our own thing. And there's actually a great counterexample during the Cold War even of the space industry where, you had the early days of NASA where this was like on the one hand, yes, a government project, but on the other hand, like there was a whole lot of contracts that were going out into the world. And there was a fascinating 600-page report which recently got shared to me called Sharing Space, the secret interaction between NASA and the National Reconnaissance Office, which does like all the space, takes photos from space and whatnot. And it's this fascinating sort of like uncomfortable dance back and forth between NASA, which is like the most open organization in all of government, and the NRO, which is like, everyone's spy's spy. And the sort of the kind of nuance that's going to end up having to take place when it comes to AI is exactly what you said, Abby. It's like it seems preposterous to me that the U.S. government is ever going to build a $500 billion data set anytime soon. But it also seems preposterous to me the straw man that Leopold was arguing about, that like government would not be involved in something where the AI gets on a trajectory that sort of stays on this like log scale growth, and all of a sudden it's very clear to everyone and their mother that this is the thing that's going to define the 21st century. I do want to come back to that, like where to draw the line on China engagement question, because I do think it's like a really important and messy one. On the one hand, like there was lots of stuff in your report about like, look, this is one of America's strengths. Like we get the best immigrants. Everyone still wants to come here. The amount of foreign born talent, which is currently working at all these AI labs and founding all these companies, is like really remarkable. And not something you want to necessarily throw away. But on the other hand, state-sponsored espionage is real. And it's not something to just, cover your, put fingers in your ears about and sort of keep walking on your way.
I think it's important to continue dialogues with China on AI. However, I think it is also important to, and I don't doubt that the government is going into this with this mindset, which is with a level mindset of expectations, keeping low expectations of what we get out of it, and also not planning our own domestic, plans and intentions around breakthroughs in those conversations. And I don't necessarily mean this strictly from a government to government perspective, but even at an academic, non-government level too.
I think where we're in safe pasture is to say that one of our competitive advantages is being an appealing sort of democracy that can recruit and cultivate and attract top talent. And that is in many ways because of the nature of our system. And that's not something we ever want to lose sight of. It is an enduring advantage of democracies that we need to seek to cultivate. And so any efforts, we do need to take steps to make sure that we have a clear-eyed approach to research security. We can't lose sight of that bigger picture.
Yeah. Abby, let's talk about this moonshot mindset. Why is it important?
I think what SCSP is getting at here is that we need to raise the bar on what the U.S. innovation ecosystem thinks it is capable of. The United States has shown in the past that when the moment demands it, we can put the resources and will behind big technological ambitions, whether you go as far back as the Manhattan Project or the Apollo program, or think as recently as Operation Warp Speed. These are all moments in history where there was some outside force that demanded national effort towards a specific goal. And today is such an inflection point where the way technology is changing and accelerating and the geopolitical context in which all of this is happening means that we need to start setting a higher bar for ourselves and orient the nation around tech goals that can sort of make us believe in our ability to build big things again. And this is something that it's a current that cuts through a lot of SCSP's work. These tech moonshot ideas in the tech areas that we identify as strategically important. These are goals where if we were to be able to muster the resources and capital and talent to work on them, and today that will happen almost exclusively in a sort of public-private fashion. But if we do that, we can sort of set a technological bar. We can achieve a position of advantage that will allow the United States to leverage this technology towards our other goals.
I'm going to play a clip from Jason Kelly, who's the CEO of biotech startup Ginkgo Bioworks and the
co-chair of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotech.
I think we kind of made this choice somewhere along the line. Because like if you look back in the 40s and 50s, that sort of post-World War II era, obviously government was doing big technological projects all the way through the Apollo program and so on and so forth. Like it needs to be like if you gave the Sam and OpenAI. Remember, so OpenAI was a nonprofit when it started, right? If you had just given Sam Altman the budget to do OpenAI in the government, he would have done it, right? Like this idea that the government can't recruit like amazing people to do amazing technological things is not true. That they just think they can. Right. And then they also have a system where they're kind of like not pulling, like recruit the best person in the world and give them the budget. Don't recruit the person that's been in the government system for X amount of time. When you're talking about these high tech, you're saying, oh, the technology, great. That's probably true. Great. So then recruit the person out of the private sector, give them the budget, put them in charge of it. Right. Like you could get the best people in the world if you did that. Right. Yep. You could get Elon to run NASA. Right. Like you would just need to give them the budget, right? Like I swear to God, this would work. And so I think it's false to think that government doesn't have that power. You've got the checkbook, man. Like the budgets are bananas, right? And what these people want is impact, right? So I don't think it's quite as simple, right? Like it's just the government doesn't think it could do capital allocation like that anymore. But it certainly used to.
It's a really interesting thought experiment, and it's kind of a bummer to think about, like how much of these types of breakthroughs have been left on the table. I mean, like a lot of the examples you just pointed to were like, mid 20th century ones. Operation Warp Speed, like I feel like kind of doesn't count. Maybe, I don't know. It seems like a bit of a one-off, but like, we had like genome sequencing, but it is really surprising to me looking at, you see the Chips and Science Act get funded, and then like all the science part like didn't really get the appropriations everyone was hoping for. It has been kind of discouraging. Like apparently there's all this like very easy fruit to pick, and creating a vaccine that will mean I never have a cold again. And the NSF tip, the new directorate everyone was excited about, like didn't get as much funding as people hoped, and like the money ended up actually coming out of like main NSF. So I'm totally on board with you in that, like the capability is there. And there are sort of projects that could use some directed funding, but when Biden comes into the White House saying he wants to do a cancer moonshot, and like it just kind of dies. I don't know. Is like China as a boogeyman just like not enough to get legislators excited about putting money towards this sort of stuff?
I think that what this starts with is the need for organizational continuity around national tech strategy.
Mm.
So government can think about these issues more long term if it has the right structures and setup to do so. The way it currently works is there's all these different offices in various parts of government make tech lists that are oriented around the issues or the domains that they focus on. But there isn't a singular tech list for the nation that lays out the technologies we need to win in and where we stand on those vis-a-vis our rivals. So if there were to be something like a technology competitiveness council that sort of aggregated all those insights that are occurring in government and importantly brought the private sector and various parts of the innovation ecosystem into a national technology strategy process, we could come up with a set of bars for the nation and have a more coherent strategy that is has continuity across administrations, can think sort of longer term, and have a set out those moonshots. I think that where we are today is that absent this sort of organizational scaffolding, it's hard to sort of set and importantly maintain a strategic direction on our technology ambitions. And if the executive branch isn't crafting a strategic long-term message, that I think that makes it all the more difficult to get the necessary congressional buy-in to put resources behind those ideas. So I think that uh, based on the research we've done, all of the folks in both government and industry that we talk to, it starts with the need for strategy and the organizations that can sort of build something around that.
So this kind of harkens back to an NSCAI recommendation, which was calling for the establishment of a Technology Competition Council, or TCC. And the idea here was to institutionalize a strategic planning entity in the White House and try to insulate it from the political forces and political swings between administrations and keep the long-term view on tech strategy. The NSC today is, of course, putting out fires left and right, dealing with the daily, weekly, monthly, even yearly crises. OSTP does work on aspects of this, but creating an institution that empowers the strategic tech planning role is something at the core of what NSCA put forth and what SCSP has echoed. I think the goal here is to make innovation power central to our understanding and understanding and implementation of national power, and recognizing that technology is at the center of it. And to your point, yes, it is disappointing to see kind of this political momentum kind of slow over time. But to tie this to the moonshot conversation, in some respects too, technology is not the hurdle here. It's the institutions and the bureaucracy, and frankly, the people and the culture that are holding us back. And only time and persistent effort and messaging and having these sorts of conversations will push the ball forward.
Yeah, so I wanna do a little callback to a show that I did with Abby and PJ and Will Moreland as well.
Yep.
Where we had a good hour and a half of diving into exactly what this sort of analytical body of doing net tech assessments and putting down recommendations would look like. So we'll link to that in the show notes. You have this line in the report: "Our government is slow, often internally divided, and not inherently optimized for concerted global competition." I would like to put forward a line from JFK in 1960 when he was sort of on the campaign trail talking about, what Eisenhower has screwed up and what Nixon would screw up too. He writes, We have in 1960 most of the formal tools of foreign policy. We have a defense establishment, a foreign aid program, a Western alliance, a disarmament committee, an information service, an intelligence operation, and a national security council. But we have failed to appraise and reevaluate these tools in light of our changing world position. We have failed to adopt these tools to the formulation of a long-range, concerted strategy to meet the determined Soviet program for world domination, a program which skillfully blends the weapons of military might, political subversion, economic penetration, and ideological conquest. We are forced to rely upon piecemeal programs, obsolete policies, and meaningless slogans. I guess my question is, like, it wasn't all that great in the Cold War. Like, I'm sure there were lots of people who were writing, reports being frustrated about things that could be better. I'm curious, like, what is the actual bar to win? Even if we don't get our beautiful TTC report, which lays out the strategy that Congress dutifully funds, like, is this going to be the thing that makes or breaks the future of the 21st century? Like, how would you gauge just how important, like Washington-led coherence on national competitive adjacent policies is going to be the thing that matters the most?
Jordan, you actually did a great series. I think Peter Harrell and some others were talking about how bureaucracies, how good ideas on paper often lose their legs once they start going through the grind and the churn of bureaucracies. We've, half jokingly thrown around the idea of, like, yes, we need tech moonshots here at, coming out of SCSP. We need tech moonshots, but we also need bureaucratic moonshots, in the sense that, like, there needs to be some way, and this is the $64 million question, right? Like, some way to change the mindset. We're seeing sparks of that now. The ChatGPT, the AI, all the talk about LLMs and AI is really putting these tools in everyday people's hands. And I think that message is getting through, including through the policy process, but instilling this culture change to bring home the fact that we have to move fast. We have to move with urgency, because technology is not static, and we run the risk of being left behind.
Abby, yeah, any take on, like, how bad can you be at this and still be okay?
What I was going to say is that I think if AI progresses half as fast as the folks at the AI labs are suggesting it will, then government has little choice but to figure out how to adapt and become sufficiently agile that it can, at minimum, keep up with, if not craft policy that is sort of anticipatory of the way tech is evolving. So I think it's sort of a minimum essential step that government will need to grapple with to stay relevant in the age of innovation power.
My take is, like, this is just free money on the table. Like, having the open AIs bubble up out of the ether, like, that's the really hard part. But, like, having a government be slightly more functional, all that takes is some legislation and some money and some good people excited to work on it.
When you think about the DMV, a person's automatic responses to eye roll, and it conjures all these feelings of why, like, government at its worst, almost, in the sense that you got to go in this dark, drabby room, sit and wait for a long line for what is seemingly a pretty simple administrative thing of getting a driver's license or updating your address. Imagine a world where you have 100% success rate or customer satisfaction rate with your DMV experience, or your passport renewal experience, or, like, these daily low-hanging fruit administrative actions that could go a long way in changing people's perception of how government works for them. That is the prospect that AI can bring to changing this conversation and demystifying what role that government can play in a person's daily life.
And I think coming back to the sort of, like, Peter Harrell series, right, is, like, like these, like you're not going to not have, well, maybe you won't. DMV is the wrong example. Maybe we won't be driving cars anymore in 3 years. But like,
enough.
you're not going to not have a national security bureaucracy in 2030, right? And if the other thing is like your national security bureaucracy, like unless America doesn't exist, isn't really getting like outcompeted out of existence the way like a bad insurance provider would or whatever. So the amount of like bloat and, you know, poor process management and the types of things that AIs will be able to do really well in a year or two from now, there's just going to be a lot of room to like, you know, upgrade all of that. But it's going to take a lot more concerted action than it would in the private sector, because you'll just have like capitalism kind of weed out the firms that aren't getting with the program. Anyways, I want to talk about the sort of like largest contribution to the national tech strategy literature that we've seen come out since we last had our chat, Abby. Erica Fuchs of Carnegie Mellon University led this large NSF-funded project to start bringing more of academia into writing about national technology strategy. Curious for your, you know, thoughts and impressions reading what her and all of her co-conspirators ended up putting together, I think late last year.
Yeah, I mean, I first just have to applaud the work. Erica's great. We love the work that she's doing, and that NSF tip is funding through this. And I think this is just a great example of the might that we could bring to bear if we were to try to tie a analytic function to a national tech strategy effort. I think where the rubber meets the road is going from a analysis of where technology is heading to making a list of what technologies matter and then prioritizing them. And then even harder is getting those things done. So I think this is an essential first step, but there are even harder parts to come. And I think this is a good example of ways that we should be bringing the innovation ecosystem into these efforts from the very analytic beginnings of it.
You know, it was really interesting, right? Because like the sort of models that you and PJ put together, Abby, were much more centralized. Basically, it was like you would have a sort of like people working on this full time, right? And you know, they would have defined projects and deadlines and what have you, and it would be their full-time job to sort of think about tech strategy. And the Erica Fuchs model was very different. It was basically like, let's find people in academia in the US and try to have their research speak, Brian, like largely to the sorts of questions that would be important to understand for national tech strategy. I think it is important to have academics think about these things, but it was a little frustrating to me reading it, because I think what you were alluding to, Abby, right, was like you don't have prioritization across different technologies. You don't have like key takeaways, and like the takeaways that they ended up pulling out of the research were more downstream of the like individual academics' priorities that they came into this project before than like you know, top down first principles, like what's going to make the US the best it can be in 2030 or whatever. There's clearly room for both. And I think the more people thinking about this, the better. But it did make, after reading it, it did make me sort of pine for that TTC all the more. Because I do think that people need to be on this full time to have that sort of like cross technology, like holistic understanding of you know, what a national tech strategy should really look like in order to really give like the blueprint and marching orders to a congressional staffer or, you know, someone in OMB or OSTP or what have you.
Totally agree. Couldn't have said it better, Jordan.
I'd just maybe add one thing, which was, yes, you need technologists, scientists who know how the technology and the technology and the science works. I think you also need bureaucrats, frankly, who know how the bureaucracy works and to implement that science and technology through the bureaucracy. So again, big fans of Erica's work. And not to say that you can't have some mixture of both, but I think I think you don't want to undersell, as weird as it sounds, the skills of bureaucrats in this process.
Yeah, sure. All right. Abby, Venkat, David, thanks so much for being a part of Chinatown.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Thanks,
us.
Jordan. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
Вікно, холодне повітря щодня, відчуваю втрату мого світла. Мотори, звуки автівок замивають співи платівок. І якщо все по-справжньому набридло, хочу знову я вернути спокій. Правда, шкода, що вже все промерзло, та пішло нарешті на покій. Під звуки касети ми з тобою вдвох заснемо навіки без турбота зла. А знову чаруєм ці часи епох, щоб доля знову не завжди звела. Під звуки касети ми з тобою вдвох заснемо навіки без турбота зла. А знову чаруєм ці часи епох, щоб доля знову не завжди звела. Вікно, холодне повітря щодня, відчуваю втрату мого світла. Мотори, звуки автівок замивають співи платівок. І якщо все по-справжньому набридло, хочу знову я вернути спокій. Правда, шкода, що вже все